One of the greatest stage illusions, at least for audiences astounded and amazed, is levitation. Be it a floating lady or a magician who appears to levitate above the ground, but nobody ever says that he is flying. Why? It has to do with aerodynamic principles. First, it is just a stage illusion, if you were not yet aware. And what you see has nothing to do with thrust or drag or lift like you would encounter with the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk attaining flight. And similarly, majestic hot air balloons, like you might want to use on a getaway wedding, do not fly technically, and most kids tend to understand this basic science about how the hot air balloon is made to float, granting the ability of something heavier than air to defy the gravitational forces that would usually hold it down. Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb, and I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Very often, especially in a community with more government scientists than anywhere in the nation, you hear an explanation about anything in the current public health crisis. They will reflexively respond to you almost dogmatically that they use the science. Closing schools was because of the science, even if it seems like a drastic measure that might be achieved with less inequitable results if a better understanding of risks to manage had been applied. Alternate work schedules have been used for years in the federal government to reduce flows, especially in pandemic situations or epidemic situations, and who does not want an extended weekend? Another similar idea in terms of reducing flows to achieve social distance and other goals. Such proposals have been offered for years in contingency planning for a pandemic health crisis or epidemic health crisis, but most chose the ones that impose the greatest social and economic harms to address in this pandemic, a risk that did not seem proportional to the cost of preventing it. And so for the next few moments, we're going to examine that other side, the risk. A novel coronavirus from a new perspective, focusing primarily on its genome size, as size matters, as the largest of all families of viruses. And what a scientist would expect, just at the sheer massive size to affect how it interacts with its environment, even posing limitations and restraints upon exactly how transmissible and virulent it could be to mankind, and raising questions as to how it might have become a pandemic pathogen at all today, having been attributed to over 11,000 fatalities in the Commonwealth of Virginia alone, or a little under 4 9/11 tragedies, with most of the fatalities, the elderly, a known risk from the very beginning. The largest coronavirus measures just a little over 1 micron and is only 6 times smaller than the smallest active component in tear gas. And tuberculosis only needs to get just a few in the air and into your lungs, through your nose and mouth, to cause a health problem for you. And this very low infectious dose required is why tuberculosis is described as a highly contagious disease. Very transmissible. Unfortunately, even after a year, however, no scientist in the world has yet determined the infectious dose required to cause an infection from SARS-CoV-2, the cause of the disease condition COVID-19. But how about viruses, like the novel coronavirus? Viruses, as you may have learned by at least middle school, are the most abundant biological particles in the world, but are also the smallest, and should pose a great threat to mankind, perhaps the greatest threat. But before a novel coronavirus became a pandemic pathogen, there were only a total of 220 harmful to mankind, a very, very small number. Still, since they are very small, of those 220, scientists determined that only 5 classes of viruses appeared to pose a risk of transmission as an aerosol threat, none of which until recently appeared to present a risk of infection even in nosocomial or hospital settings. No great risk, with one exception, coronaviruses, which scientists believe had become aerosolized during aerosol-generating medical procedures, AGMP, like ventilation. Why this appeared to happen only with coronaviruses like SARS and MERS, there were no answers expressed, and these preliminary conclusions raised additional questions because it is well established through rigorous examination of tracer contacts for these prior coronaviruses, MERS and SARS, they lack a sufficient level of infectiousness and secondary attack rate to be even described as infectious diseases being transmitted from person to person. The same pathogen profile that is presented by SARS-CoV-2, the causative agent for COVID-19. To be an aerosol transmission risk, scientists had believed that a small size was required to achieve the advantage of the ability to remain aloft, suspended in a vaporous cloud, as well as requiring a low infectious dose to achieve the best advantage in spread. But all evidence suggests that a novel coronavirus is too large in genome mass to present a natural opportunity for it to become an aerosol and lift itself off the ground and stay suspended. And it has been determined that its infectious dose is not small enough, not even a risk of indirect infection by contaminated surface contact. Still, Virginia Tech environmental engineer Lindsay Seymour and her colleagues had to have considered these restraints upon this pathogen to become the pandemic threat it had, when they still proposed that it was being transmitted as an aerosol and not through droplet transmission. And so, the problem with COVID-19 is the same problem that inventors of the hot air balloon had faced. In the water, a similar medium to air, very early on, someone had to notice that wood floats. And that idea probably helped some to develop dugout canoes. And those early sea craft were able to float because they were porous, little air holes, enough to overcome the forces of gravity that would sink them beneath the waves. Fill those porous holes with enough water, the dugout canoe will sink too. But as long as that remains constant, the dugout canoe will continue to float. But larger wooden vessels required a new understanding of those literally fluid dynamics, trying to stay afloat in the water. And someone early found that the shape of the bow, the bottom of the boat, in a wedge, could serve to displace water pressure around the ship so as to fool gravity in a very similar way that a wing on an airplane fools or manipulates the air currents to overcome gravity and achieve lift, with the aid of sufficient velocity or thrust. And if somehow it might be established that the spike crown on a coronavirus performed a similar function for coronavirus, there might be a flying coronavirus theory of transmission today. But presently, the science is restricted to principles very much like a hot air balloon. And requiring a pretty high infectious dose, one has to reimagine the conditions prior to the onset of infection, like seeing a parade of balloons sailing or floating through the air, because you need a sufficient number of these coronaviruses to cause an infection. And unfortunately, the only way through science that we know how to put several hot air balloons into the air, as would be required to infect a person with COVID-19, is in exactly the same manner and principle that we use in the hot air balloons, heating a liquid to provide sufficient vapor to suspend the particles in the cloud that may persist for up to 2 hours or more, and unless a novel coronavirus found a gain of function through natural selection to perhaps set off a 6-second burning flame to produce a vaporous cloud into which to suspend several infectious particles together and present an infecting risk, is through the deployment of a smoke grenade, a military-grade smoke grenade, as used in law enforcement for tear gas, unless you can posit a better theory. And in August of just last year, having served as the operations officer for all U.S. Army strategic counterintelligence in the continental United States, where I had the occasion to even work as a veritable biological warfare planner, I posed these very same questions to Professor Marr at Virginia Tech. And in almost a year, she has chosen a right to remain silent. Since April 2nd, 2020 in the state courts, and since June 2nd, 2020 in the federal courts, I proposed these very same theories in litigation to Governor Northam, the nation's only physician serving as the governor, and the state health commissioner, Mohammed Norman Oliver. And through their assigned counsel, Mark Herring, at the Office of the State Attorney General, they have adopted the peculiar defense strategy to evade the sheriff of the city of Alexandria and the United States Marshal. racking up an impressive list of felony offenses, and a pattern of racketeering that have so far escaped with impunity. Perhaps they possess some classified reason why they cannot enter a courtroom to refute these theories, while they have been willing to enter an appearance and dismiss other challenges brought by other plaintiffs. Perhaps this requires a political solution. We cannot say, confirm, nor deny. This briefing was unclassified. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our schools. Honest. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.